It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the streets were busy with people rushing to their destinations. Cars honked, vendors shouted to sell their goods, and the chatter of pedestrians filled the air. Among the crowd walked a young woman, quietly enjoying her walk home. She had a calm demeanor, her eyes focused on the ground ahead and her mind occupied with thoughts about her day. She was just another face in the busy city, unnoticed by most, except for one person who would change everything in a matter of seconds. At a nearby intersection, a police officer leaned against his patrol car, keeping an eye on the street. He seemed calm, but there was a tension in the way he watched people pass by. When his eyes landed on the young woman, something in his expression changed. He frowned and straightened up, adjusting his uniform. The woman didn't notice him yet, but the officer began walking in her direction, his steps deliberate. At first, the woman thought he might just want to ask a simple question, maybe something about the traffic or a local rule. But as he got closer, she sensed a harshness in his tone. Without any warning, he started yelling at her, accusing her of something she hadn't done. His words were sharp, unfair, and fueled by prejudice, and soon a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the raised voices. The woman tried to explain, trying to calm the situation. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice trembling but clear. She held her hands up, hoping to show she wasn't a threat, but the officer ignored her, his anger rising. He was no longer speaking like a law enforcer. He sounded more like someone who wanted to intimidate and humiliate. The people around her started filming, whispering to each other about the injustice unfolding before their eyes. Suddenly, without any provocation, the officer's hand shot out, and he struck the woman in the face. The impact was brutal, and she stumbled back, shocked and confused. Pain shot through her cheek, and her vision blurred for a moment. She covered her face, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The crowd gasped, and a few people shouted, demanding that he stop. Some tried to rush forward, but the officer waved them off aggressively. The woman's heart pounded, and tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the shock of being treated this way in broad daylight. She had never felt so powerless. Around her, people were recording on their phones, some yelling for help, others calling the police department's hotline to report the incident. Every second felt like an eternity. Despite the chaos, she tried to remain composed. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was not alone. The support of strangers, even if just moral support from the crowd, gave her a small sense of courage. She slowly raised her hands again, speaking in a calm but firm voice. "Please stop. I haven't done anything." "You can't do this to me." The officer didn't listen. His aggression seemed to increase with every word she spoke. It wasn't just about control. It was clear he wanted to make an example out of her. His voice boomed over the noise of the street, demanding obedience, disrespecting not just her but everyone watching. People began murmuring among themselves, wondering if anyone would intervene. Fear hung in the air, a tense silence between the chaos of the city. At that moment, two figures appeared at the edge of the crowd. They were tall, commanding attention without even speaking. Their presence alone made people stop and turn. One of them had an unmistakable confident stance. The other moved with quiet strength. They weren't just ordinary bystanders. They were men known for standing up against injustice, for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The woman noticed them and felt a sudden glimmer of hope. She had no idea who they were yet, but seeing two people willing to step forward gave her courage. The crowd parted slightly as they approached, sensing something important was about to happen. The officer noticed them too, and for the first time his confident demeanor wavered. The taller of the two stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying authority. He addressed the officer directly, asking him to step back and let the situation de-escalate. The second man stood beside him, ensuring that the young woman had a safe space between herself and the officer. Their presence was not threatening. It was protective. The energy around them shifted. People who had been tense and fearful now felt a sense of relief and hope. The woman took a cautious step toward them, still holding her face where it had been struck. She was wary, unsure if this would make things worse, but the two men made it clear they were there to help, not harm. One of them motioned for her to move behind him, shielding her from the officer's reach. She obeyed, grateful for the protection and the presence of someone willing to stand by her in such a terrifying moment. The officer's aggression faltered slightly as he faced these new arrivals. He was no longer in complete control of the situation. The crowd sensed it too, whispering and filming, their attention divided between the officer and the two men who had just entered the scene. The tension remained, but there was a shift, a small but important change in the balance of power. The woman's mind raced. She was in shock, her body trembling, but she also felt a spark of strength. She realized that this was no longer just about her. It was about standing against injustice. She wasn't alone anymore, and that knowledge made her chest tighten with a mix of fear and relief. Her eyes met the gaze of the two men. She could see determination and kindness in their expressions. They were here to ensure she wouldn't be harmed again. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow. People who had been bystanders now became witnesses, some stepping closer to record, others calling for proper authorities. The sounds of the city seemed to fade slightly, replaced by the murmurs of concern and the low hum of tension. Every person watching knew something significant was happening, even if they didn't yet understand the full scope. The officer took a step back, but his pride was wounded. He clenched his fists, his face red with frustration. The two men didn't back down. Instead, they spoke calmly, telling him that violence was unacceptable and that he needed to leave the girl alone. The words carried weight, not just because of who was speaking, but because they were the voice of reason in the midst of chaos. The young woman finally felt a small sense of control returning. She was still scared, still in pain, but the fear of being alone had diminished. She realized that standing up in some form, even by just staying calm, mattered. It mattered because people were watching, because help had arrived, because the world wasn't entirely unfair. As the moments passed, the officer hesitated. He glanced at the growing crowd, at the recording phones, at the two men protecting the girl. It was clear he was reconsidering his actions, though stubborn pride kept him rooted to the spot. The two men, sensing his hesitation, continued to assert their presence, ensuring he understood the line he could not cross. The young woman, hidden behind the protective stance of the two men, felt tears streaming down her face, not from the pain alone, but from relief. The sudden fear that had gripped her body now slowly began to ease. She could breathe again if cautiously. She realized that courage wasn't just hers alone. It could come from unexpected places, from strangers willing to risk themselves to protect someone who needed it. In that crowded street, with cars passing by and people whispering, a small but powerful change had begun. The woman, though still shaken, stood taller. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also a turning point, a moment that would remind her and everyone watching that standing up against injustice could come from unexpected allies. And just like that, the scene that had begun with violence, fear, and chaos now had the first sparks of hope. The young woman's story, her struggle, and the bravery of those who intervened had begun to unfold. The city carried on around them, unaware of the small miracle happening in the middle of its bustling streets, a story that would soon inspire and remind everyone who witnessed it that courage and compassion could shine even in the darkest moments. The young woman's heart was still racing from the sudden attack. Her cheek throbbed with pain, and she could feel the sting every time she touched it lightly. But more than the physical pain, it was the fear and humiliation that weighed heavily on her. She had never imagined that walking down a busy city street could turn into a nightmare in just a few seconds. Her mind kept replaying the moment the officer's fist had struck her face. The confusion, the shock, the disbelief, it all felt unreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Around her, the crowd was buzzing with whispers and low murmurs. Some people were still recording the incident on their phones, their hands trembling slightly. Others were discussing among themselves, angry and confused, questioning how someone with a badge could behave in such a cruel and unjust way. The air was thick with tension, and the atmosphere was heavy with fear, anger, and uncertainty. Despite the chaos, the young woman tried to focus. She needed to stay calm and composed, even if only to protect herself. She looked around, noticing faces full of concern and sympathy. Some people were moving closer, wanting to help but hesitant to intervene directly. The officer still stood nearby, glaring at her, his posture rigid and confrontational. His presence made the young woman's stomach churn with anxiety. Yet a small voice inside her reminded her that she wasn't completely alone anymore. From the edge of the crowd, she noticed the two men who had stepped in earlier. Their presence was reassuring, like a shield in the middle of all the chaos. They weren't just bystanders. They carried a sense of authority, calmness, and confidence that seemed to push the tension around them slightly aside. One of the men, taller and imposing, kept his gaze fixed on the officer, making it clear that he was not afraid. The other man moved closer to the young woman, subtly signaling that she was safe behind him. The officer's aggression didn't disappear, though. His pride was wounded, and he clearly felt challenged by the presence of the two men. He stepped forward slightly, raising his voice and trying to assert control over the situation. But his words lacked the same power they had moments ago. People noticed the shift. The balance of power was slowly changing. The young woman, still hiding behind the protective stance of the two men, felt a flicker of hope. Her breathing was uneven, shallow at first, but she tried to steady it. She reminded herself to stay calm, to not make sudden movements, and to trust the two men who had arrived to help. They were not just standing there. They were actively assessing the situation, looking for the best way to defuse it. Their eyes were focused, alert, and protective, giving the young woman a sense of safety she hadn't felt since the officer had first attacked her. People in the crowd began to react more vocally. Some shouted for the officer to stop, demanding that he leave the girl alone. Others called out, urging him to respect the law and the people around him. The voices, while varied, carried a collective force that added to the pressure on the officer. He was no longer acting in isolation. Every action was being watched, recorded, and judged. The young woman noticed this and felt her courage grow just slightly. The taller man, the first to step forward, spoke directly to the officer. His voice was calm, measured, but firm, carrying a weight that made people around him stop and listen. "You cannot treat someone like this," he said, his tone authoritative but not threatening. "Step back and resolve this properly. Violence is not the answer." His words cut through the tension, and for a moment the officer hesitated. The second man moved closer to the young woman, gently gesturing for her to stay behind him. His presence was steadying like a rock in the middle of a storm. He kept a careful eye on the officer, ready to step in if necessary, but his demeanor was non-threatening, assuring the young woman that she had allies in this frightening moment. She nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement that she trusted them, even though the fear still lingered in her chest. The officer's frustration grew. He took a few steps forward, attempting to intimidate both the young woman and the two men, but the crowd's energy had shifted. The people who had been hesitant to get involved were now actively speaking out, their voices joining the calm but firm words of the two men. The officer was beginning to realize that this situation was no longer under his control. The realization seemed to unsettle him, though he tried to maintain a rigid posture. The young woman felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear was still there, sharp and heavy, but it was now joined by hope and relief. She watched as the taller man calmly approached the officer again, this time making it clear that any further aggression would not be tolerated. His stance was firm, his eyes unwavering, and his voice carried authority. The officer glanced around, noticing the phones recording every movement, the voices of the crowd, and the calm, unyielding presence of the two men. For the first time, the young woman felt a sense of empowerment, even though she hadn't done anything herself. The courage and strength of the two men had created a protective space, allowing her to breathe and regain some composure. She touched her face lightly, feeling the pain but also reminding herself that she had survived the worst of the initial attack. The physical pain was temporary, but the emotional impact lingered. Yet in that moment the weight felt slightly lighter. The taller man continued to engage the officer, speaking in a calm but firm tone that left little room for misinterpretation. "You have a duty to protect, not to harm. Step away, and we can resolve this peacefully." The words were clear, unwavering, and carried the moral authority of someone who knew how to stand up for what was right. The crowd reacted positively, some clapping softly, others nodding, and the young woman felt a renewed sense of safety. The second man stayed close to her, his presence quiet but powerful. He subtly guided her to move slightly back, away from the immediate danger, and reassured her with gentle nods. His calm demeanor had a grounding effect, helping her control the shaking in her hands and the racing of her heart. She realized that sometimes courage wasn't just about facing danger alone. It could come from the support of others who were willing to stand by you. As minutes passed, the tension in the air began to shift. The officer no longer shouted as loudly. His movements became more hesitant. The two men maintained their calm, authoritative presence, giving the young woman space to collect herself while ensuring he couldn't intimidate her further. People in the crowd began to step back slightly, respecting the protective barrier the two men had created around her. The young woman's thoughts wandered briefly. She remembered all the times she had felt powerless in her life, moments when she had been treated unfairly but had no one to turn to. Now, witnessing these two men stand up for her, she realized that even in the darkest moments, support could appear unexpectedly. The kindness and courage of strangers could make a real difference. The officer, now realizing the situation was spiraling beyond his control, hesitated again. The taller man's unwavering gaze and firm words left no room for argument. The second man remained by the young woman's side, a constant reminder that she was not alone. Slowly, the officer's posture softened slightly, though the tension still lingered. He looked around, aware that every movement, every decision was being observed and recorded. The young woman, still behind the protective stance, took a deep breath. Her mind raced with relief and lingering fear. She was aware of the pain in her cheek, the embarrassment of what had happened, and the shock of experiencing such aggression in public. Yet amidst all that, she felt a spark of courage. She realized that she had survived the initial assault, and that help had arrived when she needed it most. The taller man spoke again, his tone calm but firm. "This is not acceptable. Violence like this cannot be ignored. Step back or authorities will handle this appropriately." His words were not just directed at the officer, they were a statement to everyone watching. Injustice would not be tolerated. The crowd responded positively, some clapping softly, others recording more deliberately, ensuring there was evidence of the intervention. The young woman felt a sense of gratitude swell inside her. She could barely put it into words, but she knew that the courage and intervention of these two men had saved her from further harm. Their actions had shifted the balance of power, turned fear into hope, and reminded her that even in frightening situations, there were people willing to stand up for what was right. As the moments continued, the officer's aggression diminished further. He took a cautious step back, reassessing the situation. The taller man's authoritative presence and unwavering stance had made it clear that any further violence would have consequences. The second man remained close, ensuring the young woman stayed safe while allowing her to regain composure. For the first time since the attack, the young woman felt a glimmer of control. She could breathe more easily, focus on her surroundings, and begin to think about what to do next. The presence of the two men had created a safe space, even amidst the chaos and fear that still lingered on the busy city street. In that moment, the young woman understood something important. Courage and protection could come from unexpected places. Strangers, if willing to stand up for what was right, could make a profound difference. And sometimes, even in the scariest moments, hope could emerge, carried by the actions of those who refused to let injustice go unchecked. The young woman still clutched her face, her cheek sore and tender from the blow. Every nerve in her body was on edge, and the memory of the officer's aggression lingered like a heavy cloud over her. She had felt powerless a few minutes ago, but now, with the two men standing firmly beside her, there was a fragile sense of hope. Yet the fear hadn't disappeared entirely. She knew the officer could still lash out, and the uncertainty of what might happen next kept her heart pounding. The taller man, the one who had first confronted the officer, kept a steady gaze, his posture confident but non-threatening. He spoke calmly to the officer, repeating the demand for him to step back and stop the aggression. His words were clear and unwavering, carrying authority without anger. The officer, however, seemed stubborn, his pride wounded by the fact that his behavior was being challenged openly in front of a growing crowd. The second man, remaining close to the young woman, whispered softly to her, encouraging her to stay behind him and assuring her that she was safe. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly, just enough to breathe without panicking. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos around them, and she realized that sometimes the presence of someone strong and protective was enough to give courage even in moments of extreme fear. The officer took a step forward again, attempting to regain control. His voice was raised, harsh and full of false authority. He seemed determined to assert dominance, perhaps hoping the crowd would be intimidated by his badge and uniform. But he underestimated the two men now standing between him and the young woman. They were no ordinary people. They carried a weight of confidence and moral authority that the officer could not easily dismiss. The taller man spoke again, his voice firm and measured. "This is not just about you or me. This is about what is right. You cannot use your power to hurt someone else. Step back now." His words echoed through the small gathering, drawing the attention of every bystander. People were watching closely, some still recording, others whispering to one another about the courage of these two men and the injustice of what had just happened. The officer's expression shifted for a moment. He glanced at the phones, noticing that the scene was being documented by dozens of witnesses. The realization that every action he took was being recorded seemed to shake him, but his stubbornness and pride prevented him from backing down immediately. The tension on the street was thick, a silent battle of wills between authority and justice. Meanwhile, the young woman felt a mixture of fear and awe. She had never been in a situation like this before. Her pulse raced as she realized that two strangers, strong, confident, and unafraid, were willing to put themselves between her and danger. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixed with disbelief. Could it really be happening? Could someone stand up for her so firmly when she had been completely defenseless just minutes ago? The taller man stepped closer to the officer, carefully closing the distance while maintaining a non-threatening stance. His eyes were locked on the officer's, calm but unwavering. "Violence is never the answer," he said slowly, deliberately. "You have a responsibility to protect people, not hurt them. Leave her alone." His tone carried more weight than words alone. It was a statement of principle, a declaration that injustice would not be tolerated. The officer hesitated, clearly affected by the presence of the two men and the growing crowd. He shifted slightly on his feet, glancing at the recording phones and the murmuring witnesses. The young woman still standing behind the second man felt a spark of hope. Maybe this situation could end without further harm. Maybe justice could come in the form of courage and intervention. Suddenly, a ripple of recognition ran through the crowd. Whispers spread quickly. These men were not just strangers, they were well-known figures, admired for their strength and their willingness to stand up for others. People leaned in, craning their necks to get a better look, their attention drawn to the authority and presence of the two men. The officer's hesitation grew. He was no longer dealing with an ordinary situation. The taller man used this moment to assert calm control. He did not shout or threaten. Instead, he spoke clearly, making sure the officer understood that continued aggression would have consequences. "Step back now," he said again, this time with a slightly firmer edge. "If you continue this, it will be on record and authorities will take action." "This is not acceptable," the crowd murmured in agreement, their collective presence adding moral pressure to the confrontation. The second man remained close to the young woman, subtly encouraging her to stay calm while still keeping her safe. His steady presence reminded her that she was not alone. Even though she was shaken and in pain, she felt the tiniest bit of strength return, a quiet acknowledgement that courage could be shared, and protection could come from unexpected places. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, took a small step back. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and his eyes flicked nervously between the two men, the crowd, and the recording phones. It was clear he was realizing the situation had shifted, that he no longer had complete control, and that the witness accounts would not allow him to act with impunity. The taller man did not let him regain confidence. He continued to speak calmly but firmly, outlining the seriousness of the officer's behavior. "You have a duty to protect everyone, not attack them. The people here are watching, and this will not be forgotten. Step back and do what is right." Each word was deliberate, carrying moral weight, and the officer's resistance weakened further. The young woman, still hidden behind the protective stance of the second man, felt her heart slowly begin to settle. The immediate threat had diminished, though the fear remained. She touched her face lightly, still feeling pain but also realizing that she was safe for the first time in minutes. The calm but firm actions of the two men had changed the entire dynamic, turning a situation of fear into one of cautious hope. People in the crowd began to react more openly. Some shouted their support, urging the officer to leave the girl alone. Others continued recording, ensuring that every detail of the intervention was documented. The energy of the crowd shifted from fear to cautious optimism, fueled by the unwavering presence of the two men who had stepped in. The officer's body language softened slightly. His fists unclenched and his shoulders slumped just a little. He seemed to be weighing his options, realizing that any further aggression would be noticed, recorded, and condemned. The taller man's authority, combined with the presence of witnesses, created an invisible boundary the officer could not cross without consequences. The second man whispered softly to the young woman, reassuring her once more. "You're safe now. Just stay calm. They can't hurt you while we're here." She nodded slightly, grateful for the protection and the courage he offered. It was more than just physical safety. It was emotional reassurance, a reminder that someone cared enough to intervene. The taller man took one more step forward, making sure the officer understood that the situation was serious. "This behavior will not be tolerated. Step back now, or this will be handled properly by the authorities." His voice carried finality and conviction. The officer looked around, noticing the entire crowd's attention fixed on him, and slowly, reluctantly, he began to retreat. The young woman's chest tightened with relief. For the first time since the attack, she felt a glimmer of safety and hope. The immediate danger had lessened, and she could finally breathe without the constant edge of fear. The presence of the two men, their calm authority, and the support of the crowd had turned the tide. As the officer stepped back, the taller man remained vigilant, his gaze fixed on the man to ensure he did not attempt another aggressive move. The second man stayed close to the young woman, offering quiet words of encouragement and reassurance. She felt a mixture of gratitude, awe, and relief. These men had intervened when no one else could, standing up against injustice with courage and calm authority. The crowd began to disperse slightly, though many remained, whispering about what had just happened. People exchanged glances, nodding in quiet approval at the bravery and quick thinking of the two men who had prevented further harm. The young woman, still trembling slightly, realized how fortunate she had been. Without them, she might have been left alone with the aggressive officer, facing an uncertain outcome. For a brief moment, the city street seemed to pause, holding its collective breath as the drama unfolded. The young woman, once terrified and vulnerable, now felt the smallest flicker of hope. Courage, she realized, could come from unexpected places. Protection could appear in the form of strangers willing to risk themselves for what was right. And justice, even in its simplest form, could be enacted through bravery, calm authority, and unwavering presence. She took a deep breath, feeling her body relax just enough to gather her thoughts. The pain in her face still lingered, but it no longer overwhelmed her. Fear had not disappeared entirely, but hope had begun to bloom. The two men remained by her side, ensuring that the officer could not intimidate her again. The situation was far from over, but a crucial turning point had been reached. In that tense, crowded street, the young woman realized something profound. Courage, protection, and justice could come in the form of unexpected allies. Even in moments of extreme fear, help could arrive, and people willing to act decisively could change the course of events. She had witnessed bravery firsthand, and it had given her a strength she did not know she possessed. The young woman's hands were still trembling, and her cheek throbbed from the punch she had received. Yet amid the lingering fear, there was now a sense of cautious relief. The two men, strong, calm, and authoritative, stood firmly by her side, keeping the officer at a distance. The officer no longer shouted, but his pride and frustration were clear in the way he shifted on his feet and looked around nervously at the gathering crowd. Every glance from the two men reminded him that he could not act with impunity, and slowly the tension began to shift. The crowd that had been watching from a safe distance began to murmur among themselves. Some people whispered encouragement to the young woman, expressing shock at the officer's behavior. Others were still recording the scene, knowing that the evidence would matter if proper action needed to be taken. The energy in the air was changing, from fear and confusion to cautious hope. The young woman could feel it too, a small spark of empowerment as she realized she was no longer alone, and that her voice, her story, mattered. The taller man, sensing the moment to take the next step, spoke again to the officer. His tone was calm, yet every word carried authority and moral weight. "This is not over. You cannot walk away from what just happened. There are witnesses, and your actions are on camera. You will be held accountable." The officer hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers, realizing that the situation had gone far beyond what he could control. His pride and stubbornness were still present, but a flicker of understanding showed in his eyes. The days of unchecked aggression were over, at least here and now. Meanwhile, the second man stayed close to the young woman, speaking quietly to her, helping her to remain composed. "You're safe, keep calm. Everything will be handled from here." His words were a quiet anchor in the storm of emotions surrounding her. The young woman felt a wave of gratitude. She had never experienced this kind of protection, and it reminded her that courage could be shared, and that even in terrifying moments, support could appear from unexpected places. The taller man then made a decision. He took out his phone and started calling the local authorities, explaining the situation and emphasizing the urgency and seriousness of the officer's actions. He described the attack, the ongoing threat, and the need for immediate intervention to prevent further harm. His voice was calm, precise, and commanding, ensuring that the person on the other end understood the gravity of the incident. As the call progressed, the crowd began to respond more openly. Some people stepped forward, speaking to others about what had happened, ensuring that the incident was documented and that witnesses were available to support the young woman. Others recorded the phone call and interactions with the authorities, knowing that evidence could be crucial in holding the officer accountable. The young woman felt a growing sense of empowerment. She realized that her story was being heard, and that people were willing to help her seek justice. The officer shifted uneasily as the call to authorities continued. He knew that his behavior was being scrutinized and that the presence of witnesses and the two men meant he could no longer intimidate anyone. Slowly, the tension in his posture softened, though his frustration was still apparent. He muttered under his breath, trying to justify his actions to himself. But the authority and calmness of the two men prevented him from acting further. The taller man finished the call and returned his attention to the officer. "Help is on the way. This situation will not be ignored. You need to step aside and cooperate." His tone was firm but non-threatening, ensuring the officer understood that compliance was the only way forward. The young woman felt her body relax slightly. She could breathe more easily, though the adrenaline still lingered, keeping her alert. The officer took another step back, this time more deliberately. The crowd noticed, and some people quietly expressed relief. The young woman, still standing close to the second man, felt a small sense of victory. She had survived the initial aggression, and now the situation was moving toward resolution. The presence of the two men had transformed what could have been a moment of trauma into an experience of protection, moral authority, and support. As the minutes passed, the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. The local authorities were arriving, responding to the call made earlier. The officer's frustration turned into anxiety. He knew he would have to explain his actions, and he couldn't rely on intimidation anymore. The crowd stepped back slightly, allowing space for the responding officers to enter the scene. The young woman's chest rose and fell more steadily now. Relief washed over her as she realized that real help was coming. Not just moral support, but the presence of officials who could enforce accountability. She could feel her body relax, even though the memory of the attack and the lingering pain in her cheek remained. The two men stayed near her, their calm and authoritative presence continuing to provide reassurance. When the authorities arrived, they immediately assessed the situation. The taller man explained clearly what had happened, pointing out the officer's aggression and the young woman's distress. He emphasized that there were witnesses and recordings of the incident, ensuring that the authorities had all the information they needed. The young woman spoke briefly, still shaken but now able to recount her experience with the support of the two men. Her voice was steady, if slightly trembling, but the weight of fear had lessened. The responding officers took the situation seriously. They spoke to the aggressive officer, asking him to step aside and comply with their instructions. The young woman felt a surge of hope. Finally, the system seemed ready to respond to the injustice she had suffered. The taller man continued to observe, ensuring that the officer did not attempt to act aggressively again, while the second man stayed close, reassuring her that she was safe. Witnesses came forward, offering statements and sharing their recordings. Each account reinforced the young woman's story, leaving little room for doubt. The officer, now fully aware that his actions were being scrutinized, could no longer deny what had happened. The crowd's murmurs of support and the presence of the two men had created an environment where truth and accountability prevailed over aggression and intimidation. The young woman felt a growing sense of empowerment. She had been the victim of an unprovoked attack, yet the intervention of others combined with the presence of witnesses and authorities had given her agency. She realized that being brave didn't always mean facing danger alone. It could also mean allowing others to support you and ensuring that justice was pursued. The taller man remained a steady presence, observing every interaction between the authorities and the aggressive officer. His eyes scanned the scene, ready to intervene if necessary, but mostly ensuring that the young woman felt protected and supported. The second man stayed close, speaking quietly to her, encouraging her to remain calm and reminding her that she was no longer alone. The responding officers eventually spoke directly to the aggressive officer, making it clear that his behavior was unacceptable and that disciplinary action would follow. The officer's shoulders slumped, his arrogance replaced by a mixture of frustration and realization. He knew that his actions could no longer go unchallenged, and the combined presence of witnesses, the two men, and the authorities ensured accountability. The young woman finally allowed herself to breathe more freely. Relief, gratitude, and lingering fear mingled together, but the sense of empowerment was stronger now. She had survived, been protected, and now had her story heard. The two men's intervention had not only ensured her safety, but had also created a path toward justice. She realized how important it was to stand up against aggression, even if you needed the support of others to do so. As the scene continued to calm, the crowd began to disperse slowly, still whispering among themselves about the courage and intervention they had witnessed. The young woman remained close to the second man, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The taller man spoke briefly to the responding officers, ensuring that the incident would be properly documented and that the aggressive officer would face consequences. For the first time since the attack, the young woman allowed herself to feel a sense of closure, if only partial. She had been brutalized unfairly, yet she had survived, been supported, and had justice on the horizon. The experience was a stark reminder of how fear and courage can exist side by side, and how support from others can make all the difference in moments of crisis. The taller man gave a final nod to the young woman, signaling that her safety was now secure. The second man stayed close, reassuring her that she was protected and that the authorities would handle the situation. She smiled faintly, grateful beyond words for their intervention and moral support. In that busy city street, amidst the chaos, fear, and aggression, a sense of justice had begun to take shape, a powerful reminder that courage, support, and accountability could prevail even in the most frightening circumstances. The young woman sat quietly on the curb, her cheeks still sore but no longer throbbing with the same sharp pain. The city street around her had slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried past, and the chatter of people filled the air once again. Yet even as the normal sounds of the city returned, she felt a lingering tremor inside her, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and exhaustion. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into something unimaginable, but she had survived it with help she never expected. The two men who had intervened stayed nearby, watching over her, ensuring she was completely safe. The taller man spoke briefly to the authorities, confirming that the young woman was okay and that the officer who had attacked her would face the consequences of his actions. The second man remained close to her side, offering quiet words of reassurance. "You're safe now. Everything is being handled," he said. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, not just from the physical pain, but from the overwhelming relief that someone had stood up for her when she had been completely vulnerable. Bystanders who had witnessed the incident lingered, whispering among themselves. Many had recorded videos on their phones, ensuring that the story would reach a wider audience. Some offered the young woman kind words, expressing their shock at what